Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today's a Q&A episode, and I have 3 questions I want to dive into. But first, before I do that, I just have a few ways you can help support the podcast. So first, if you have found this podcast to be helpful in any way, if you could leave a rating and review, and that will help more people find this podcast. Next, I have my free masterclass on body recomp, what it is, how to do it. And I also have a free masterclass on nutrition periodization. Again, what it is, how to do it, how to go through different phases. And the link to both of those is in the show notes. And then if you haven't yet, give me a follow on Instagram, Jeff, HOEHN_, and that's where I'm the most active on social media there with that. So with that out of the way, let's dive into today's question. So the first question I have, let me get my phone going here. How to approach fat loss with endurance goals. I get really hungry. They're doing a 10K and a half marathon. So what I'll say on this is, depending on your current body comp and overall goals, I usually won't have someone in a fat loss phase when training for long distance events. If you're somebody that is pretty overweight, I think a small calorie deficit wouldn't be the worst thing in the world during this period of time. But if you're fall outside of that, you're a little bit on the leaner side, you have a good amount of muscle, or again, maybe you want to add more muscle, even if you don't have a lot of muscle, right? Like I would still put you in this. You're probably, I wouldn't have somebody fat loss diet when trying to get ready for an event like this. A lot of people will use like these marathons and stuff to get them ready for these events. And again, I think there's just a better way to go about it. This is where you do run into issues of adherence, losing muscle. And then depending on what you want to do, I also mentioned like your overall goals. If you're trying to do well in this event, which maybe you aren't, obviously that's going to get impacted as well. So I think the first thing is figure out what your goals are, right? What's the most important to you? Is it body composition goals? Is it then like what is the most important? Because I do think that at a certain point, they are going to converge and you are going to have to decide. But one of the big issues and one of the reasons why I don't have clients do this is because, what you're seeing firsthand, right? The potential of high hunger. I think that's a big thing there. Because if you're going to be doing a lot of training volume, that right there is you're going to expend a lot of energy. And then if you're also restricting your calories, there's going to be this pretty large energy deficit, and it's going to be really hard to manage that. So again, if you can control your food intake, that will help. But again, either way, if you're trying to elicit a calorie deficit and you're doing these high amounts of activities or high training volumes, there's going to be some hunger involved, and it's going to be really hard to manage this period of time to maintain that calorie deficit. But like I said, you also have higher energy needs from the high training volume. So being in a deficit will also impact your marathon performance there. Again, you're not doing anything like super long, but the half marathon, 13 miles, that's going to require some pretty good amount of training there. Again, I wouldn't advise going into a calorie deficit or trying to drop body fat during that period of time. This specific person, I asked them, they're doing their half marathon first, and then they're doing the 10K. So I think with the 10K, you could fat loss diet through, because again, the training volumes won't be super high, but the half marathon, I would really reconsider that. But again, understand it really does depend on what your goal is. But also remember this too, because you're also going to be doing high training volume potentially for the half marathon. It's also important to weight train in this process, because if you don't weight train in this process, you're also going to risk losing muscle. But in general, I think if you're trying to fat loss diet while trying to train for a half marathon, I think your risk for losing muscle does go up a bit there with that. And this also is dependent on your current nutrition. Again, if you don't have a good base of nutrition and you just wing it, again, you're going to be increasing the risk of muscle loss in this process. So ultimately, you can do both, but you just need to decide if the risks are worth it. So again, the risks of being in a deficit during training for these are going to be, one, the potential risk of muscle loss, high hunger levels. So it's going to be really hard to stick to that calorie deficit. And just the higher needs is going to impact your marathon training, right? So this is why initially I said, hey, you need to figure out what's most important to you. If it's, hey, I really want to run this half marathon, my endurance goals are super important to me, then maybe for you, it's, hey, you take a break from fat loss during this period of time and you focus on the half marathon training, right? You focus on still weight training, eating enough protein, recovering. So then that way you have a lot of resources available to train for the half marathon. You're going to have the energy for it, and you're not going to risk muscle loss. And when this period of time, you're probably going to maintain your weight relatively easy because of the high energy needs, right? But you're also not underfueling your body, which is super important. And when I say super important, I mean it's important to fuel your body during this period of time. But like I said, you can choose, you may have to choose one for now, then focus on the other at a later time. I just want to give you 2 examples here of clients that I've done this with. The first is a long-term weight loss client. Okay, so this is somebody who their main goal is they do want to drop some body fat and drop weight. And in the past, they've always their weight has yo-yoed, right? It's gone up, it's gone down. I mean, a lot of times their trend down usually is combined when they would try to fat loss diet and run half and full marathons in that process, right? And this is they lost a lot of muscle in the process, and then they would ultimately gain the weight back on the way up there with that. Decided was we want to make sure that because again, she likes marathons, she likes running halves. And so during her training for the races, we will bring her calories closer to maintenance. Again, maybe it's like a very small deficit, but either way, we're trying to get her closer to her maintenance during this period of time. And then once she is done training for the races, then we go back into fat loss phases and we try to push that calorie restriction. There's that. Maybe she's doing like some baseline amount of cardio just to maintain that. But we're not pushing the fat loss and the weight training or in the marathon training at the same time. And again, she ultimately wants to drop weight. So it's again, on paper, it would make sense to, hey, you just increase your running, you're going to drop weight. But again, that typically backfires with more hunger. And then if you do stick with it, that period of time afterwards can be very challenging, especially if you just go back to what you were doing before. So again, it's super important that we get her calories closer to maintenance and making sure she's fueling her body. So then again, that way she has enough energy for the training. And then on top of it, she also maintains her muscle during this period of time, which is super important. And then the next example, a client currently, he is actually a week out now. He has a long distance event. It's a ruck that's a full marathon. And so with him, again, he's somebody who wants to improve his body composition. He wants to drop some body fat. He's not necessarily super lean by any means where he's like sub 10% body fat, probably around 20-ish%. Again, a good spot there to continue to drop body fat. However, we tried a small deficit initially, but after chatting, we decided it was best to put him at his maintenance calories leading up to the race, finding that his performance was suffering. He was super hungry. He just didn't feel great in that process. And so it was really impacting his training here with this. For him, he wants to do well in this race. Again, he's not necessarily trying to place in like the top 5, but he wants to do well. He wants to feel good training for this. So we ended up bringing his calories closer to maintenance during this period of time. So that way he could feel himself for his training there. And again, like I said, he's going to maintain his weight during this time. And then afterwards, we will go into a fat loss phase once he's done training for this. The amount of running volume he was doing increased hunger. And sorry, it's not necessarily running, it's rucking. So it's not necessarily running, but either way, the amount of volume he was doing was increasing his hunger. So it was really challenging for him to stick to that deficit. And again, like I said, he wasn't feeling great in his training session. So he'll do this race and then afterwards, we'll bring him into a fat loss phase. So again, I really would not approach fat loss and endurance goals at the same time. I think you either need to go at a very slow rate, so that way you have enough energy for training. So again, like a really small calorie deficit, or when you're training within, say, 6 to 12 weeks of the race, go to maintenance, really fuel your body, and then afterwards look at transitioning back to a fat loss phase. There with that is that's going to be something that's going to be good for your body composition and best for your training performance there with that. Okay, so next question is, when dieting and weight loss has stalled, how long would you wait to adjust macros? So I do think this depends on your goal a bit, which a lot of these do, but this one specifically really does. So if you have a date you need to end the fat loss diet by, I'd be a little more aggressive. Okay, so if it's like, hey, I have a trip, I want to be lean by this period of time, or hey, you have a bodybuilding competition you need to be ready for, or a competition you need to be ready for, then I would be, or another example, I have a client who does MMA fights. Again, he has a weight that he needs to be at by a specific period of time. So with that, we need to be a little bit more aggressive, right? It's more proactive, but then also being like super aggressive with the reactionary changes as well too, right? So again, look at your goal. If you don't have a date you need to be done by, then it's up to you at that point. You can be a little less aggressive. I think, as a coach, knowing the client and knowing what keeps them motivated is also going to factor into this, right? But just because they're not patient, that's a thing that we may need to work on there with that. But either way, if you don't have a date that you need to be done by, I think you can be a little less aggressive, and it really is up to, again, if you're a coach, the person you're working with, and then if it's up to you, like you're coaching yourself or making decisions for yourself, it's how do you respond to those things, right? So what I'll say on this though is, for clients, this usually ends up being anywhere between 1 to 3 weeks of them being stalled. I think no matter what, if you're stalled out for 3+ weeks and we don't make some sort of adjustment, that's probably not the best there. Again, it's going to really depend on the client's specific situation. But again, anybody that really does want to see results in a fat loss phase, I would say no more than 3 weeks, right? There with that. But in saying this, it's also important to look at your progress pitch, your measurements, and how clothes are fitting, because sometimes you're seeing fat loss despite the scale not moving much. So again, it's important that you track other data besides just scale weight. So again, just because you aren't necessarily seeing your scale weight go down doesn't mean you are not seeing results. And I think as people get leaner and as they the more weight they lose, I would argue that if you just focus on the scale weight, you are going to be doing yourself a disservice from a body composition standpoint, and you may be hurting yourself in the foot. I feel like in my last fat loss phase, I maybe did this a little bit too much where I wasn't tracking my macros super in depth. I was going more off of how many meals per day, just eating the same things. And I was just monitoring my body weight. And towards the end, I did just feel a little more depleted than I did in my previous fat loss phases. I just wasn't overly happy with my physique. And I look back and I feel like I probably lost a little too quickly, and I was overly focused on just that scale weight and less on body composition, and it bit me in the ass there with that. So again, make sure you are tracking other things within this. So typically how this looks though is say you have, again, we want to be a little bit more aggressive. You have 1 week where things stall out. Okay, hey, we're really looking into it. Look at your adherence. Did you maybe not track as much? Did you have more meals out? We'll really dive into that. And then during that week, if we're not seeing things trend down after that 1 week, okay, we probably need to make an adjustment. If it's somebody who doesn't have that end goal, that first week, hey, shit happens, right? Like you're going to maybe not see your scale weight move down every single week. Okay, it is what it is there with that. We're going to really look at progress pics, measurements, how clothes are fitting. Maybe I start to ask them about their adherence. Second week goes by, again, nothing moving. Hey, again, look at your adherence. What's going on here? Again, let's look at progress pictures, measurements. And then after that second week, we go into that third week and things still aren't moving at all. Now it's okay. Hey, now we probably need to make some sort of adjustment. We probably need to bring calories down. But what I'll say on this is more times than not, it's not the calorie amount. It's more so the adherence. If you have to keep changing your calories or feel like you have to keep decreasing them, I would really look at your adherence, and probably not the calorie amount that's the problem. It is the adherence. Again, if we get calorie amounts off of the internet, just understand that those could be off. And so you may need to make some adjustments initially, but then you also may need to make some adjustments throughout the fat loss phase. But I would say if you have to make more than 3 to 4 adjustments, there's probably something going on from an adherence standpoint there with that. So again, to answer this, it's going to depend on your goal in terms of how aggressive we're going to be. I would say on average about 1 to 3 weeks of a plateau is where we're going to be at. And then remember to also look at things like progress pics, measurements, and how clothes are fitting. And adherence is a bigger issue than most people think there with that. All right. So last question of the day is how many times per week / how to program back training. So I like this. So I want to dive into some back training tips and just how I go about programming for that. So on average, I like to program back 2 times per week. And within that, I like to divide it up between upper back and lat focus. Okay. So upper back's going to be more elbows flared out. Lat focus is going to be elbows closer into the chest, and usually not letting them come too far past the body there with that. Okay. So that's the first thing. From there, I like to do a combination of rows and pull downs. So again, we'll do something like where you're, again, just like it sounds, right? You're rowing, and then pull downs where you're pulling overhead there with that. Again, I talked about elbow placement. Again, generally speaking, elbows flared out is going to be more upper back. Elbows tucked in, not going too far past the body, is going to be lat focus. Again, there's ways to even bias your lat and upper back training even more, but just a small change in elbow placement has made a big difference in back training for my clients. So just keep that in mind there with that. Also train the biceps, the back in the lengthened position a little bit more. For example, say when you're doing a pull down, that our lats are in the lengthened position at the top, and then when we get further down to the bottom, they are going to be more shortened, right? However, the shortened position is a little bit more challenging. So we probably have a little bit of room for work in that lengthened position. So maybe do a little bit more partials. So this probably means you're leaving a little bit in the tank from the lengthened position. And so we can probably get a little bit more out of our back training there with that. So again, maybe doing a little bit more partial work for your back from time to time can be super helpful. Use chest support when you can. By using chest support, you can place more tension on your back muscles. So for example, use like a chest support dumbbell row over just a bent over row with that. Utilize Versa grips. This can be super helpful. This can help you place more tension on your back instead of your forearms. It's also really helped me with like tendonitis and whatnot there with that. Make sure you use progressive overload. Okay. So we want to make sure we're overloading our back training over time. Too often I see people spin their wheels with their back training because they don't take it as seriously as other muscle groups. So we do want to make sure that we're spending time overloading and getting stronger with our back. And so I just want to go over how back training may look like for a week. So what this looks like. So session 1, again, understand that in session 1, there might be other muscle groups we're working, but specifically within this session, what our back work is going to look like. It's going to be, for example, upper back overhead pull down, right? So this is going to be a lat pull down where maybe those elbows are flared out a little bit more. We'll probably do 2 to 3 sets. Then we'll have a lat focus row. So again, this is where you got that elbow tucked into the side a little bit more. And again, we're not going too far past our body there with that. Again, 2 to 3 sets. And then we might do like an upper back row. Okay, so maybe this is a chest support dumbbell row. Maybe it's a machine row where, again, our elbows are flared out a little bit more there with that, right? So we hit upper back twice, but we hit it with the overhead pull in a row, and we also hit the lat focus row there with that. So then we have session 2. This could be on Monday, you do session 1, session 2 might be Thursday. And again, this is probably going to have some other muscle groups within the workout. So this isn't the only 3 things you'll do for the workout. But again, this is just specifically the back side of things there with that. So session 2 might be a lat focus overhead pull or row. Again, we're going to do 2 to 3 sets of that. With this, we're going to do a row where, or a pull down where those elbows are probably about, or the grip placement's probably about shoulder width apart. And again, we're going to keep those elbows tight to the body there with that. And maybe think about pulling down to your hips with that. Then we have an upper back overhead pull or row. Again, ultimately what you want to do there with that, again, we did an upper back row and upper back pull. So we have an option to do either or there with that. So again, elbows flared out, 2 to 3 sets. And then to wrap up back work, we might do a lat focus roll or overhead pull, again, depending on what you started with there with that. And again, what you want to bias. I usually try to keep it 50-50 across the board, but if there is anything that you specifically want to bias, again, whether that be rowing over pulling or lat over upper back, again, it's ultimately up to you there with that. So that's how the back training would work there with that. Let me know if you have any questions. Again, back training, I feel like is often overlooked. And again, these are some small things that have really helped with my back training over the last couple of years. Definitely been like a game changer from the back side of things. I feel like my back development is much better than it was years ago. And again, I can thank all these things that I just chatted about with that. So that's it for this episode. Let me know if you guys have any questions, and I'll chat with you next time.